We've all heard the story of David versus Goliath and how one little shepherd boy defeated a well-trained mammoth of a Philistine soldier named Goliath. That David, by the world standards, but really by any human logic, had no chance of winning against this giant of a man. However, we all know the rest of the story of how David defeated Goliath. Now, in this very quick look at Psalm 139, what I want to point out is David was more than just a warrior, but a true man of God. And David didn't just depend on God for strength and strategy in battle, but David depended upon God for everything. To illustrate this, maybe we could look at this as Goliath could represent the strength of a man. That maybe Goliath, beside maybe Samson, maybe Goliath was one of the strongest men who ever lived. But perhaps maybe one of the greatest worldly minds that ever existed was the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. And it has been said that one of the principles Socrates lived by was an unexamined life was not worth living. That Socrates was advocating that we as human beings should always test ourselves or examine ourselves in everything, but especially in purity, in motives, and in our actions. That we should question everything so that we can get a better understanding of what is around us, but even more importantly, who we are and what is our purpose in life. But with that thought, I think we could even take it a step further through other examples of self-examination. And some of those examples could be, as I already said, who am I? Why am I here? Why did God put me here on planet Earth anyway? What is my purpose in life? And do I have a greater purpose than what I'm doing or what I'm living right now? And to me, these are all questions of self-examination. However, coming back to Psalm 139, David seems to take all this a step further. David said in verse 1, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." And even in 23 and 24, David again said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." David seems to be advocating not necessarily self-examination, but examination through the one true God of heaven. You see, David knew that God knew him better than what he even knew himself. And so, even going beyond self-examination, David was calling out to God to examine him. David said, if you come back up to verse 2, let's change colors. David said, "You know my sitting down and my rising up." You see, God knows everything that I do. That there's nothing that I can do that God doesn't know about it. But not only does God know what I do, but he even went as far as saying, you understand my thought afar off. That God doesn't just know what we're doing, but he even knows what we're thinking. But not only does God know what we're thinking, but if you look at verse 3, you comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all of my ways. That in other words, God didn't just know what David did, or God doesn't just know what we do, but he knows what we're thinking, and he even knows our motives and motivations behind what we do. David even went as far as saying in verse 4, "For there's not even a word on my tongue. But behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." That David was saying, you even know what I say. David came to the conclusion in verses 14 through 16. He said, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. It was as if David was saying, God knew every one of his days before he ever even lived them. That just as God told Jeremiah the prophet in Jeremiah chapter 1 that God knew him before he was even formed in his mother's womb. And so with that knowledge, David knew that God was the only one who was truly qualified to examine him rightly. That yes, David could go through a time of self-examination, and I'm sure that David did go through times of self-examination. However, here in this psalm, David was acknowledging that God was the only one who was qualified to examine his life rightly. In verses 17 and 18, David said, How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they should be more in number than the sand. Could you imagine going to the beach and trying to count all the grains of sand? But David knew that's how much God thought about him. And so God was the only one who was truly qualified to examine David's life. But not just David's life, but how about our lives as well? Paul, giving instruction to the Corinthian church on the Lord's Supper, also said a very similar thing. He said, But let a man examine himself. And going down through the years, Ben Franklin even picked up on this as one of his guiding principles of life. That one of his guiding principles for living was to be like Socrates and to live like the Lord. And so, in conclusion, there are times when we need to take a time for self-reflection and self-examination. However, self-reflection and self-examination should be done through prayer, asking God, just as David did in Psalm 139. In verses 23 and 24, David said, Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And upon asking God for this help, be open to the Holy Spirit to change you and transform you to be more like Christ.